Begin. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, kicking up a cloud of ochre dust that clung to Silas's worn traveling coat. He coughed, a dry, raspy sound, and peered out at the town of Harmony Gulch. It wasn't much to look at. Wooden buildings, bleached by the sun, lined a single wide street. The boardwalks creaked under the weight of an unseen boot, and a church bell, cracked and silent, sat crooked on a small, rickety steeple. The air hummed with the lazy buzz of flies and the distant, mournful lowing of cattle, the unmistakable soundtrack of the frontier. Silas, a minstrel whose nimble fingers once danced across lute strings in grand halls, felt a pang of something akin to loneliness. His own music had faded, replaced by the quiet creak of his aging bones. He stepped down from the coach, his carpet bag feeling heavier than usual. His eyes, though, were drawn to a squat, humble building at the far end of the street, the Harmony Gulch Church. Its paint peeled like old skin, and a few broken window panes stared out like empty eyes. Inside, through a door left ajar, Silas saw it. Tucked away in a dusty corner, half hidden by shadows, was an organ. It was a sad sight, battered and neglected. Its pipes were dented, its wooden casing scratched, and the once proud keyboard was a jumble of yellowed, missing keys. A tattered piece of leather hung from what must have been its bellows, looking like a broken wing. The instrument seemed to sigh, a silent testament to forgotten melodies. Silas, a man who had made music his life, felt a strange pull. It wasn't just an old organ. It was a ghost of music waiting to be brought back to life. He imagined the rich, full sound that once filled this small space, a sound that could stir souls and bring people together. He looked at his own calloused hands, hands that hadn't played a proper tune in years. Maybe, just maybe, they had one more song in them. End. Begin. The urge to fix the organ settled deep in Silas's bones, a familiar ache that had been missing for too long. He was old, yes, and lonely, but the sight of that silent instrument stirred a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He spent the next few days poking around the dusty church, his fingers tracing the rough-hewn timbers and the worn pews. He found a small, rusted toolbox tucked away in a corner of the vestry, filled with forgotten things. A claw hammer, some bent nails, and a few screwdrivers with chipped handles. Not ideal, but a start. His first task was to truly look at the organ, to understand its wounds. He ran a hand over the yellowed keys, some stuck down, others loose and clattering. He pressed one gently, imagining the sound that should have come out, but only silence answered. The leather bellows, once plump with air, now hung in sad, ragged strips like a broken bird's wing. He knelt, his knees protesting, and peered into the dark recesses where the pipes should have stood in neat rows. Some were bent, others completely missing, leaving gaping holes. Silas spent hours just studying the instrument, a quiet conversation between an old musician and a forgotten song. He noticed the fine dust that coated everything, the cobwebs strung like forgotten melodies. He imagined the breath of air that once filled these pipes, turning silence into music. He knew it would be a long, slow task, a patient unraveling of years of neglect. But as he carefully pulled a loose key from its slot, examining the tiny wooden peg underneath, a flicker of excitement, small but warm, began to glow within him. This was more than just fixing an organ. It was a chance to mend something in himself, to bring life back to a place that felt as broken as he sometimes did. He would start with the bellows, he decided, for without breath, there could be no song. End. Begin. While Silas worked on the organ, the town of Harmony Gulch went about its daily, grumbling business. It wasn't a friendly place, not really. The townsfolk were split like a cracked plate. On one side were the ranchers, tough men with leathery faces and dust-caked boots. They spent their days out on the range, herding cattle, and they thought the shopkeepers were soft and didn't understand real work. When they rode into town, their spurs jingled loudly on the boardwalks, and they usually headed straight for the saloon. On the other side were the shopkeepers and the folks who lived in town, the ones who ran the general store, the blacksmith, and the livery. They thought the ranchers were wild and messy, always bringing dirt and noise into their neat little shops. They muttered about cattle trampling their gardens and loud arguments spilling out of the saloon. You could feel the tension in the air, thick as the dust. Arguments would spark up over small things, the price of feed, a stray cow, or just the way someone looked. A rancher might stomp into the general store, demanding credit, while the store owner would sigh loudly and complain about the smell of horse manure. Whispers followed people around, and smiles were rare. The church, standing silent and broken, seemed to fit right in with the town's mood. Nobody went there anymore. The bell was silent, just like the laughter and easy talk that should have filled the community. Silas, busy with his tools, couldn't help but notice. He heard the sharp words, saw the cold looks, and felt the heavy quiet that settled over the town when arguments died down. He wondered if the organ, once fixed, could somehow mend the broken feelings of the people too. He hoped so. He kept working on the torn bellows, thinking about how sound needed air to breathe, just like a town needed understanding to live in peace. End. Begin. Day after day, Silas toiled in the quiet church. He worked with slow, careful hands, his old eyes keen on every detail. He mended the torn leather bellows with patches of new hide he bought from the general store, a silent transaction with a curious storekeeper. He cleaned each metal pipe, gently removing the dust and spiderwebs that had collected over years. Some pipes were bent, and Silas used his strong, old fingers to gently reshape them, humming softly to himself as he worked. The sound of a tiny hammer tapping on metal, the soft scrape of a brush, and a quiet sigh of air as he tested a mended bellows filled the otherwise silent church. He fashioned new wooden pegs for the yellowed keys that were missing or broken, whittling them down to the perfect size. It was painstaking work, like putting together a giant, dusty puzzle. He spent hours on his knees, peering into the organ's dark insides, his breath misting in the cool, still air. Sometimes he'd find a small, rusty screw and replace it with a new one he'd managed to trade for at the blacksmith shop. At first, no one paid him much mind. The townsfolk were too busy with their arguments and daily chores. But gradually, a strange thing started to happen. The gentle sounds of Silas's work began to drift out of the open church doors. The rhythmic tap-tap-tapping, the soft, almost musical hum of air being pushed through a mended pipe, the occasional quiet clink of tools. These weren't the loud, angry sounds the town was used to. They were different. A rancher, riding by on his horse, might pause for a moment, tilting his head. A shopkeeper, sweeping the boardwalk, might stop and listen, a puzzled look on her face. What was that old man doing in the church? Was he really fixing that ancient organ? The sounds were too soft to be truly heard over the daily noise, but they were there, a constant, quiet presence that slowly, subtly, started to prick the curiosity of Harmony Gulch. And begin. The quiet hum of Silas's work was suddenly drowned out by a different sound, a frantic gallop down the main street. A rider, covered in dust, reined in his horse sharply in front of the saloon. "Outlaws!" he yelled, his voice ragged. "The Vulture Gang, headed this way. Heard tell they're aiming to hit the bank and the livery." A hush fell over Harmony Gulch. The usual bickering stopped dead. Faces that moments before were scowling in argument now turned pale with fear. Children were quickly pulled indoors. The ranchers looked to the shopkeepers, and the shopkeepers looked to the ranchers, but not with unity. Instead, old tensions flared. "This is your fault," shouted Old Man Peterson, the general store owner, shaking a fist at a burly rancher named Jed. "You cowboys are always stirring up trouble out on the range. Brings bad folk down on us." Jed spat on the dusty ground. "My fault? We're out there protecting our herds. Maybe if you townies weren't so greedy with your prices, folks wouldn't be so desperate to rob you." Fear mixed with anger, creating a poisonous cloud over the town. People huddled in small groups, arguing about what to do, but no one agreed. Some wanted to run, others wanted to fight, but without a plan, they were just a scared mob. The air crackled with their disagreement, louder and more dangerous than any outlaw's gun. Silas, inside the church, heard the shouts. He paused his work on a particularly stubborn pipe, his brow furrowed. He could hear the fear in their voices, but more strongly, he heard the division. They were like scattered sheep, ready to be picked off one by one. The organ was almost ready, just a few more small pieces, but would it be too late? He looked at the almost finished keyboard, then at the patched bellows. The town needed more than just a working organ. It needed a working heart. And begin. The shouts of fear and anger from the streets spurred Silas on. The outlaws were coming, and the town was tearing itself apart. He worked with a renewed urgency, his old fingers flying over the last few adjustments. He tightened the final screw on a newly fitted pipe, wiped dust from the now smooth, restored keys, and carefully placed the last repaired leather strip on the bellows. He stepped back, a deep breath filling his own lungs. It was done. The organ stood proud, no longer a broken ghost, but a silent promise. Silas took his place on the worn bench. He pushed his foot down on the pedal, feeling the resistance of the mended bellows. With a deep push, air rushed in, filling the newly repaired leather. Then, with a prayer in his heart, he pressed down on the lowest, thickest key. A sound, deep and brave, vibrated through the church. It was a low, rumbling hum that grew into a powerful, resonant chord. It was the voice of the organ, a voice that had been silent for years, now breathing life into the dusty air. The sound swelled, pushing through the open church doors, rolling down the street, and washing over the arguing townsfolk. The loud shouts and angry words died away. Ranchers stopped mid-sentence. Shopkeepers froze with their hands raised. All heads turned toward the church. The sound was unlike anything they had heard in Harmony Gulch for a very long time. It wasn't the clatter of hooves, or the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, or the angry shouts of their neighbors. It was music, rich, full, and clear, wrapped around them, a warm blanket on a cold, scared day. The notes filled the gaps between their arguments, silencing their fears for a moment. It was the organ's first breath, a mighty, hopeful sigh that called out to every soul in the divided town. And begin. The deep chord from the organ held the town still. Silas, inside the church, continued to play, his fingers moving across the restored keys, coaxing out more notes. He played a melody, simple but strong, that seemed to rise from the very earth of Harmony Gulch. The sound was like a river, flowing through the dusty streets, washing away the anger and fear that had choked the air. Jed, the rancher, who had been shouting moments before, felt the vibrations deep in his chest. It wasn't just noise. It was something that touched his heart, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a boy. Man Peterson, the store owner, stopped wiping his brow and just listened, his mouth slightly open. The music spoke to something inside him, something about home and peace. The music wasn't just beautiful. It was a reminder. It spoke of shared Sundays, of baptisms and weddings, of quiet moments of prayer. It spoke of a time when the church bell rang, calling everyone together, not just for worship, but for community. It reminded them that before they were ranchers or shopkeepers, before they were enemies, they were neighbors. They were all Harmony Gulch. As the notes swelled and faded, a strange warmth spread through the crowd. The hard lines on their faces softened. The suspicion in their eyes lessened. They looked at each other, not with anger, but with a flicker of understanding, a shared moment of awe. The music wove around them a strong, invisible thread, pulling them closer. They remembered the dust and the heat, the hard work and the loneliness, but also the times they had helped each other, the small kindnesses that had built this town. For a brief, powerful moment, the music made them forget their differences and remember that they were all in this together, facing the same dangers, living under the same vast sky. The Vulture Gang was coming, but for now, there was just the music knitting their frayed spirits back into one. And begin. As the last echo of the organ's melody faded, a quiet hung over Harmony Gulch, different from the heavy silence of fear. This was a thoughtful quiet, a moment of shared reflection. Jed, the rancher, cleared his throat. That music, he started, his voice rough but softer than before, it made me think of how he built this town. Man Peterson nodded, surprising himself. We all put our sweat into this place. Ranchers, shopkeepers, everyone. Suddenly, the anger seemed small, petty. The music had reminded them of something bigger. Their common home, their common future. The Vulture Gang was still coming. The danger hadn't gone away, but their way of looking at it had changed. "We ain't got time to be squabbling," Jed declared, looking directly at Peterson. "Those outlaws ain't gonna care if you run a store or a ranch. They'll take from all of us." "He's right," said a woman from the bakery, stepping forward. "What's our plan? We need to work together." And just like that, the arguments were gone. The music had cleared their minds, allowing them to see the real problem. Ranchers who knew the land and how to move fast started talking to shopkeepers who knew the town's buildings and where supplies were kept. They began to make a real plan. Some would gather what few guns they had. Others would secure the windows and doors of the bank and general store. The livery owner explained how to best hide the horses. Silas, still at the organ, watched them. He played a soft, hopeful tune now, a background to their growing unity. He saw Jed and Peterson, once bitter rivals, discussing the best lookout points, their heads together, no longer grumbling, but talking, truly talking. The organ's breath, moving through its pipes, was like the town's own breath, coming together, strong and steady. They were a community again, facing a threat not as scattered parts, but as a single, determined whole. And begin. The Vulture Gang arrived just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery reds and oranges. They rode hard, a menacing line of shadows against the fading light. But this time, Harmony Gulch was ready. Ranchers and townsfolk stood side by side, some with rifles, some with shotguns, and others with whatever they could find, pitchforks, old axes, even sturdy brooms. They were scared, yes, but no longer fighting each other. From a church, Silas continued to play. His music wasn't a gentle tune anymore. It was a powerful, marching beat, a rhythm that pulsed with courage. The air breathed through the organ's pipes, creating a wave of sound that rolled over the town, a living presence that wrapped around each person. The ranchers felt it deep in their guts, a familiar strength, like the rumble of a stampede. The shopkeepers felt it too, a steadying force that calmed their shaking hands. The outlaws pulled up short, surprised. They had expected a chaotic, divided town, easy pickings. Instead, they saw a unified front and heard the strange, strong music coming from the church. It wasn't church hymns. It was a defiant, brave melody that seemed to say, "You will not pass." Silas played on, his old fingers dancing over the keys, his foot pumping the bellows with all his might. Each note was a breath of courage, a whisper of hope. The music filled the space between the townspeople, tying them together, making them feel like one strong wall. It was a sound that told them they weren't alone, that they had each other. When the first shots rang out, the townspeople stood firm. They returned fire, not with the wild abandon of fear, but with a surprising calm. The music swelled, a shield against the fear, a steady heartbeat for a town that had finally found its rhythm. The air vibrated with the organ's song, pushing back against the darkness and the danger. And begin. The battle was short but fierce. The Vulture Gang, surprised by the town's united stand and the strange, booming music, found themselves outmatched. They had expected easy prey, but instead faced a town that fought as one. Soon, the outlaws, bruised and beaten, turned tail and galloped away into the darkness, leaving Harmony Gulch safe, if a little dusty and tired. As the last sounds of hoofbeats faded, a cheer rose from the townspeople, a cheer not of triumph over an enemy, but of relief and, more importantly, of shared victory. They looked at each other, not as ranchers or shopkeepers, but as neighbors who had faced a threat together. Hands were shaken, backs were clapped, and a few even offered apologies for past wrongs. The air, once thick with tension and anger, now smelled of gunpowder and something new. Kinship. Silas, his fingers tired but his heart full, played a final, soft melody on the organ. It was a tune of peace and gratitude, a quiet hum that settled over the victorious town. The organ, once broken and forgotten, had not only found its voice, but had helped Harmony Gulch find its own. Its powerful music had woven them together, stitch by stitch, into a strong, new fabric. From that day on, the organ in the church was never silent for long. It played for Sunday services, for town meetings, and sometimes, just because, its sound became the heartbeat of Harmony Gulch, a constant reminder that they were stronger together. The once silent church bell was repaired and rang clear, a joyful sound echoing the organ's song. Silas, the old minstrel, no longer felt lonely. He had found his purpose again, not in grand halls, but in a dusty, frontier church. He watched the townspeople, ranchers and shopkeepers alike, gather for a shared meal, talking and laughing, no longer grumbling. He was no longer just a visitor. He was a part of Harmony Gulch, a home he had helped build with music. He smiled, a genuine, happy smile, knowing he was finally where he belonged. And